Hello, welcome back to Simon's Rants. I'm Simon, and today I'm giving my on second thought on Me, Myself, and Irene. Now, this is your spoiler warning. If you care about this movie being spoiled for whatever reason, you should pause it, go watch it, come back, and we can talk about it then. Now, in case you don't know, Me, Myself, and Irene is a 2000 film starring Jim Carrey and was directed and written by the Farrelly brothers. It follows a state trooper from Rhode Island who has suppressed anger issues, going through traumatic experience after traumatic experience until finally his personalities are split. From there, he gets caught up in hijinks involving Renee Zellweger, and a bunch of stuff happens, and this movie is just kind of crazy and over the top. What do you expect? It was written by the same guys that did Dumb and Dumber. So like I just said, this movie came out in 2000, so it was a few years after Jim Carrey had just reunited with Tom Shadyac in Liar Liar, who was of course the director from Ace Ventura: Pet Detective in 1994. So what else to do but reunite with another group of directors from 1994 who made Dumb and Dumber to make this movie. It's all perfect. Except it wasn't. Ever since the surprise success of Dumb and Dumber, the filmmakers had hit a bit of a downslope. Nothing that they made after Dumb and Dumber was remotely nearly as successful in any way. Some people like Kingpin, and a lot more people like There's Something About Mary, but neither of those lived up to the expectations set by Dumb and Dumber. So Me, Myself, and Irene was an attempt by both the Farrelly brothers and Jim Carrey to get back on track, so to speak. Not that Jim Carrey needed the help necessarily. He had just won 2 Golden Globes back-to-back for Man on the Moon and The Truman Show, but neither of those were comedies, so I think he thought getting back to his roots a little bit would be successful for both parties. And he was kind of right. The movie was somewhat successful, but I think it's obvious that it wasn't as good. And Me, Myself, and Irene is still a fairly decent movie. I enjoy it to an extent. I would probably give it a 6.5, but I give it a 6.5 mainly based on Jim Carrey's comedic timing and physical comedy ability, and that's about it. There's some good writing in there. I will admit that. There is some good writing in there. There's good situational comedy at times. There's good lines. There's good moments, like him attacking the cow because it just won't die, and he's trying to put it out of its misery, but it just won't die, so he keeps trying to kill a cow. That's probably the best part of the movie. It's really funny to me. But honestly, most of the comedy that you get out of this movie is Jim Carrey's physical comedy as he's fighting back and forth between the two halves of himself, which, by the way, is some of the best physical comedy you'll ever see in any movie. It's some of the best physical acting you'll ever see in any movie. Jim Carrey has listed previously that one of his biggest inspirations to become an actor was Dick Van Dyke, and you can see that in his performance in this movie. Not that the comedy is remotely similar, because I think Dick Van Dyke wouldn't take part in any movie remotely close to this, but you can tell the physical control that he has over the smallest muscles in his body is astounding. And I know that he looked up to actors from that era that could sing, dance, do everything, and he wanted to be like that. But if I'm being honest, I think that he became the best physical comedy, the best physical actor ever, and it's not a debate. Although I just said in my opinion, but it's my opinion that it's not a debate. I guess it still is a debate if somebody else has another opinion. I don't know. Take your meds, kids. You don't want to be ADHD like this. Million directions, million miles per hour. Anyway, there's a movie review to do, right? I think also that this movie was Jim Carrey's attempt to come into a new era of much more gross comedy. Not that he hadn't done crude humor before. I mean, most of his comedies are PG-13, but this movie is an R. There's a lot of language, there's a lot of gross out jokes, and it's just overall, I don't like watching this movie that much because of it. Not because I'm overly sensitive to gross out humor. I think that that can be good in the right place and done right. But I think a lot of the humor in this movie was just trying too hard. Trying too hard to shock you. Trying to have that shock value instead of actually trying to come up with something unique and funny. And I think a lot of this movie is just a failed attempt at that. Now, a lot of it still works. A lot of the movie's still funny, especially Jim Carrey. But I don't know that any other actor in this movie really brings anything funny to the table at all, even when they're trying to. I mean, Renee Zellweger's perfectly fine in her role, but she's not funny. When you look to the rest of the actors that are attempting to be funny in this movie, they don't really bring anything to the table that I find personally funny at all. Now, that's a generalization. There are some funny moments other than Jim Carrey, but I think he's the main powerhouse behind it, which makes sense. I mean, he's the big budget, big name actor, but the rest of the movie just feels like it's there and you don't really care about it. You're just waiting for him to be back on screen, and it's not enough. It doesn't feel like a complete movie, and I just don't really care about anything in the movie other than him, and he plays such a split character.
God.
How the character is written is it's deliberately made so that you're only supposed to like him half the time, if that. Even when he's being funny, you just kind of hate him at times because the character is detestable. And so honestly, there's not a whole lot to like about this movie, because even though it has funny moments, and even though the acting is really impressive at times by Jim Carrey, there's not a whole lot else there. And like I said, Renee Zellweger's fine, but she was obviously miscast in this role. You can tell from the dialogue in the movie where they're having a conversation about her boob size, where he says that she got a boob job and she's like, no, these are natural, and it's like she's like an A cup, and you're like, what do you mean, a reduction surgery? But like, I'm not criticizing her. She's a beautiful woman. She's also a great actress too. She just won an Oscar. But the point is, like, why? It's not bad writing because you wrote that about a character that you had in your head, I'm assuming, looking different than that character. But once you cast that actress in that role, why wouldn't you change it? Why wouldn't you change the dialogue? Why wouldn't you make it make sense? That's just an example of how altogether this movie feels sloppy. It feels like this movie wasn't made with much care. It's like a lot of forced jokes, a lot of forced plot points, a lot of things that just don't really work together. And I know the plot isn't that important in comedies most of the time, but when the comedy isn't that great and I'm looking for any reason to keep watching, you're not giving me one. And I don't think that anything I'm saying is particularly divisive or unpopular of an opinion. I think pretty much everybody's going to agree with most of this because it doesn't have a great rating, and everybody's opinion of the Farrelly brothers is pretty much the same, is that they made Dumb and Dumber, which was good, and then other than that, people just think of movie 43. I mean, they made Green Book. That was great, but probably half of you forgot already that they made Green Book. But everybody else that remembers still remembers the moment that they won the Oscar going, wait, those two idiots made that movie? That was my reaction. Because they're not, generally speaking, good filmmakers. They have an eye and an ear for comedy to an extent. But it feels like their best movie, obviously Dumb and Dumber, was a bit of a happy accident, where they kind of just walked into that with the chemistry and the great acting and comedy between Jeff Daniels and Jim Carrey. And even in that, when you watch like the extended cut or the unrated version, you see some of that awful writing that made it into Me, Myself, and Irene and the rest of their movies. Those scenes are just gross out comedy for the sake of it and don't make anything funnier or better. And I feel like other than Dumb and Dumber, the rest of their movies are filled with moments like that. Some less than others, like Me, Myself, and Irene, are up on the higher end of the echelon, on the higher end of the scale, compared to like Hall Pass, and then of course at the lowest of the low, movie 43. And then somewhere also in the middle you've got Shallow Hal and Kingpin and those other movies, but for the most part they don't make good movies. They make extremely inconsistent movies that can have, if you've got the right people involved, very funny moments. And this is one of those movies. It's got some extremely funny moments. Like I mentioned the cow scene before, I could watch that scene on repeat a couple times and enjoy myself. But that's not the norm for this movie. And unfortunately, it happens fairly early on in the movie, is you've set that bar of comedy gold, and then they don't really ever reach that height again. They get close a couple of times. There's some really good moments in there, but for the most part, it never gets close. And like I said, a lot of it's just failed attempts at being surprising and gross in ways that people find funny. Like, there's a couple of shocking moments that work. Early on, when he has that first snap moment where he switches personalities and it cuts from him doing one thing to like drowning the little girl, that was shocking in a funny way. But for the most part, none of it's actually funny, because none of it's actually really shocking. None of it's actually surprising. Diversion of expectation is really important in comedy, especially when your entire comedy is gross out humor and surprise shock humor. You need a diversion, and if you can predict where it's going, or you're not surprised or taken aback by where they're going with it, then you're kind of failed as a comic. There's nothing there. And that's what most of this movie felt like to me. I mean, watching it for the first time as like a 13-year-old, you're like, oh, it's so dirty. Oh. But as an adult, you're just kind of like, yeah, okay. Good. Really? That's what you came up with? It's just immature. There you go. I don't know why it took me that many minutes to figure out that the word I was looking for this movie was immature. It is the epitome of immaturity in comedy, and it doesn't really hold up. It's not that great. But if you remember at the beginning of the video, I gave it somewhere around a 6.5, and that's true. But like I said, I'll double down on this. The best part and only real great part about this movie is Jim Carrey and his comedic timing and physical acting. He redeems a lot of this movie, and he makes it worth a watch. But you may not want to watch it again, and you may have no interest to ever come back to it or talk about it again. You might just want to YouTube the part with the cow. Honestly. But anyway, that's just what I thought. But what did you guys think? Let me know in the comments below what you guys thought, and of course don't forget to like, share, and if you're new here, subscribe. Thanks guys.